Since the morning, the rain had been pouring steadily and wearily, slicing the cobblestones and collecting at the gutter edges like forgotten thoughts rather than in torrents. With his large fingers encircling a glass of beer that had long since warmed up, Maigret sat at the window of a tiny café close to the Gare du Nord, not far from the Boulevard de la Chapelle. The café's mirror was covered with condensation. The smell of coffee and wet wool wafted between the tables like smoke, and the gray daylight softened the space. He wasn't working. Officially, no. He rarely took time off, and Madame Maigret had to convince him to do so this morning. She left with her umbrella and a bundle of string-wrapped little cakes, intending to see her cousin in Suresnes. With no responsibilities, Maigret was left on his own. He strolled aimlessly until he came to this café that brought back memories of people he had known 20 years prior, when he was still wearing a sergeant's coat and held the idea that justice should be administered with a clear edge. A slender, impatient guy entered, shook his umbrella, whispered something to the proprietor, and vanished up the steps back of the bar. Maigret followed him because his haste was so inappropriate for such a leisurely hour. Not because the man was suspicious. He pictured rooms upstairs, dimly heated, dimly illuminated, with walls that allowed every step to reverberate below. Maigret lit his cigarette. His mouth still tasted sour from the beer which he had forgotten. The door opened again, and this time it was a girl, maybe 25 years old, with black hair from the damp and a beige raincoat. She paused at the doorway, seemingly forgetting why she had come, and then nodded to the bar owner, who only cocked his head in the direction of the same staircase. The girl took her time. Clinging to her purse as if retrieving an unrequited favor, she ascended the steps slowly. Maigret moved a little in his chair and grabbed his coat. Why he was following was unknown to him. He had no summonses, no calls, and no cause. However, the girl's hesitation, or perhaps the silence she left behind, had stirred him up. He was slow. The aromas of cooking, old wallpaper, and the faint perfume of someone trying to hide something, probably cabbage with a hint of lavender, filled the air as it grew stiller as it up the small staircase. The hallway was dark, characterized by its ability to absorb sound. For a minute, Maigret stood listening with her coat unfastened. No sound was heard, not from voices. There were no footsteps to be heard. The only sound against the sloping ceiling was the subdued drone of rain. Somewhere toward the end, a door opened, then shut down once more. Maigret retreated and went down. He had no intention of interfering, not quite yet. Just as the cafe proprietor unasked for a fresh glass of beer, he went back to his seat. After staring at Maigret for an excessive amount of time, while wearing a pale towel over his shoulder and going bald, the man said, "Another calm morning, Inspector?" Maigret bowed his head but did not grin. "Upstairs, the same elderly folks?" he inquired. The man gave a shrug, for the most part. Once more, room 6 is unoccupied. The back of the girl in 8, the seamstress. She used to work nights, but lately she hasn't been out much, you understand. Maigret gave a hesitant nod. He was aware of the situation. The scream suddenly sounded from the top of the stairs. Not too loud, not a show. However, short, muted, and definitely human. The coffee shop froze. A saucer and a spoon clinked together. The owner stayed put. Nobody did. Maigret had already ascended half of the steps. The hallway wasn't quiet this time. Pale wood cracked around the lock stood an open door. There was no sign of the girl in the raincoat. The seamstress's chamber, number 8, had a slight, liniment-like, dusty fragrance. The same scrawny man who had risen earlier was inside, stooped over the little bed, like a person praying or throwing up. When Maigret walked in, he looked up, his eyes wide, his lips parted, and there was a panicked look just beyond his face, as though he wasn't sure whether to run or explain. The man said, "She just collapsed." A woman was lying on the bed. One side of her carefully pin-curled hair had fallen out. She had a waxy, pallid face. She had rolled one stocking to her ankle. Where she had been stitching, a needle was still attached to her blouse. Maigret moved forward, breathing in the space without touching anything. "Who are you?" he asked, turning to face the stranger. "I bring her fabric," she said. "The Rue des Petites Écuries is where I'm from." Maigret remained silent. It wasn't a tragic room. Not quite yet. It was messy, but in a bad way. The way of someone who had begun to unravel but hadn't finished, not the way of a terrible seamstress. He leaned a little closer. The woman's respiration stopped. The rain continued to fall outside, soft and steady, as though it were attempting to erase the day before it had even begun. Maigret remained motionless, breathing through his nose as though, if he didn't speak too loudly, the room itself could say something to him. As the seamstress lay still, her fingers curled close to a small bundle of thread and muslin scraps. The low light from the corridor sliced over the floorboards and reached as far as the short iron-framed bed. Like a youngster in front of a schoolmaster, the man, who was selling fabric, lingered close to the wall without touching anything. He had his feet together and his back straight. It was difficult to tell, but he appeared to be around 35. Like linen exposed to too much sunlight, he had that prematurely dried appearance that certain men in the textile profession developed. His shoes were inexpensive but clean, and his collar was wet, most likely from the rain. Maigret did not immediately ask him another inquiry. He started by examining the room. A teacup, still warm, rested on a table leaning against the wall, a liniment bottle. Over the back of the chair was a piece of half-sewn gray flannel, possibly a house coat or skirt. The drapes were thin and still, yellowed at the edges, but the window had been closed. No evidence of struggle were seen. Nothing was overturned. The room was not immaculate, but it was organized out of habit rather than pride, as if the owner didn't expect guests. Something about it didn't quite fit, though. Without knowing why, Maigret could feel the muscles in his neck tense whenever something wasn't quite right. He bent over and lightly touched the woman's neck with 2 fingers before moving them to her wrist. "Chilly. She's dead," he whispered quietly. The man remained silent. Maigret stood up and turned to face him. "How much time have you spent here?" "I just got here." "I believe a few minutes before you. Did you discover her in this state?" "Yes, I knocked, but she didn't answer. I looked at the bed and the door wasn't locked, so that's how I discovered her." "You let out a scream?" I believe so." With a subtle nod, Maigret moved past him to open the tiny wardrobe by the window. Clothing, all in subdued hues. Primarily handcrafted. 1 or 2 were obviously changed, with hems restitched and darts added. A woman who repurposed and conserved fabric. Not a trace of luxury. However, there were no indications of acute poverty. "Does she live alone?" "Over his shoulder?" Maigret inquired. "I think so. All I bring is cloth. Once every 7 days. She occasionally receives customized orders." "From whom?" "Customers, local women, a couple of shop girls. Sometimes a Montmartre resident comes in to get a stage costume fixed." Maigret turned around. "What is her name?" "Laurence Perreux." The name didn't evoke any memories for Maigret. As though he could feel its shape, he repeated it out loud. Perrin. Laurence. A gentle name, not the type that readily adheres to violence or controversy. "She hasn't been getting out much lately, you mention." Confused, the man blinked. "I didn't say that." "No. However, the proprietor of the cafe did." The man's mouth opened just a little before closing once more. With a low, calm voice, Maigret called down as she moved back into the corridor. He assumed the name was Lemoyne, the cafe owner, who came halfway up the stairs and paused to closely examine Maigret's face. "Make a call to the nearby station. Request that someone be sent up." After that, Maigret vanished back into the room and shut the door. Now there was quiet, the kind of sound that settles after breath has left a room. Not the lack of sound. Maigret walked around the bed once again and looked at the little nightstand. Les Dames aux Camélias is a spine-cracking dog-eared book. A brush for hair, a pressed powder tin with a fracture in the middle, and an open envelope with nothing in it. He took it up. Miss Lawrence Perrin, 3rd floor left, was the straightforward address for the front. No address for return. No stamps. Delivered by hand. What are your knowledge of her? Maigret turned around to face the man and questioned abruptly. The man switched his weight between the 2 feet. Not a lot. Just the things you discover after several trips. She didn't say anything. Kept to herself. Paid on time every time. Never be impolite. I believe so. Are there any guests? The man was hesitant. Sometimes. Primarily women. Are there any men? On occasion. I was unable to identify them. A single one at a time, please. I didn't stay long. Maigret took a step forward, to read the slight movements in the man's eyes, not to threaten. Why did you shout, too? I didn't intend to. It was simply looking at her. Such as that. I didn't anticipate. Maigret hesitated. I believe she might have passed out. He trailed off. Or... A knock on the door was heard. Silently, 2 local precinct police came in. One didn't say anything, but recognized Maigret. As if mentally cataloguing things they would never comprehend, the other started taking notes while scanning the room. Maigret motioned the cloth vendor to come downstairs with the officers. He said, Wait in the cafe? I might want to talk to you once more. Maigret sat when the place was quiet again. Not in the chair, but beside the seamstress's corpse at the foot of the bed. He lighted his pipe, took off his cap and set it on his knee. Like a query without words, the first intake of smoke spiraled toward the low ceiling. He was still unsure of why this death bothered him. The victim was not a young person. She was older than that. It wasn't the place's squalor, either. There wasn't any, but something else was involved. The feeling of the space was produced. It was tidied with remorse rather than with care, as though there had been a visitor, lately. Someone who, although leaving a smudge too faint to be visible immediately, wanted the place to look unaltered. Maigret has her sights set on that. The smudging. He could hear the officers, the cafe proprietor, and maybe a new client buying a demi talking in the background downstairs. Life continued. He grabbed the open envelope once more. Nothing is inside yet. The paper, however, had a fragrance. Faintly, not fragrance. Something more homely, like old soap or squeezed flowers. He put in his pocket. The woman on the bed had half-lidded eyes and a barely open mouth when he eventually got up and turned to face her again. She didn't appear scared or calm, just not yet ready. As though she had been anticipating something that had never materialized. The rain had stopped outside, but the scent of ash and wet stone filled the air through the window. Dim, ambiguous light shimmered on the rooftops across the boulevard. Maigret walked into the hall and silently shut the door. As usual, when no one was looking, he would start by identifying the deceased, rather than identifying the murderer. Maigret walked slowly down the little flight of stairs. Though no one would say it out loud, the smell of coffee, cigarette smoke, and something somewhat metallic that clung to the moist wood filled the air. It might have been the lingering presence of death. The peaceful cadence of the cafe below had returned. The 2 officers from the local station waited by the window, feigning not to be watching the street, while a man at the counter stirred sugar into a glass of white wine. Seated in a corner booth, the fabric vendor, still pale, was tapping his fingers impatiently on the table, as though he was trying to remember the beat of a long-forgotten song. Maigret walked slowly over and slid into the seat opposite him. As he steadied the wobbling salt shaker, he remarked, "I'm going to ask you a few more things." "Not as a charge?" "Just to comprehend." The man gave a short nod. His gaze flitted to the window and back. "You mentioned Lawrence Perrin as her name. How long has she been residing upstairs, do you know?" The man gave a shrug. 2 years, possibly longer. When I began delivering, she was already there." "Did she ever make a late payment?" "Never." Before letting his pipe lie between his fingers, Maigret took a single puff. "Did she mention her clientele when placing her fabric orders?" "On occasion. She wasn't a recluse. Not talkative, though. There was a Madame Poinsot who worked at a bakery on Rue de Dunkerque, among other names she named." I never got the name of the dancer, but she needed repairs done soon. Maigret gave a nod. On which days did you typically visit? Thursdays, 10 o'clock in the morning. And today? The same. She didn't answer the door, though. I let myself in for that reason. Maigret observed that the man's hands were now tightly clasped together. Not exactly out of dread, maybe out of embarrassment. Or the start of it. You mentioned that she had guests. Occasionally. Are any of these recognizable to you? He paused. There was a tall, older woman. Even in the summer, gloves were worn. Her features resembled that of a schoolteacher. During my visit, she came twice. Didn't say much. Appeared to examine Lawrence's work. Could have been a customer. He shrugged, unsure, and added, Or an aunt. And men? Just once, a couple of months back. I was heading out. A man wearing a coat too fine for this building ascended the stairs. He did not give a nod, ignored me, simply waited for me to pass. Do you recognize his face? Not precisely. The only difference was that he appeared to be accustomed to being obeyed. Maigret allowed that to linger. Then, cautiously, he pulled the fragrant package out of his coat. Has she ever gotten any notes? Letters? Once or twice. But never post, always by hand. She would discover them nestled within the doorframe. In his hand, Maigret flipped the envelope over. I don't know who sent them. No. He pointed to the cafe owner, who grudgingly approached and used a moist cloth to wipe his hands. How well did you know the woman upstairs, Lemoyne? Maigret asked. Just as a renter, paid on a regular basis. I never raised any complaints. She didn't never raise her voice. Who was her next-door neighbor? On one side is old Madame Charrier, post-death. Additionally, there is a room that has been unoccupied for some time on the opposite side. Is there anyone else using the stairs? Lemoyne took a whiff. Some boarders move in and out. However, it has been quiet lately. The majority keep to themselves. These places are, you know. Maigret turned her gaze from him to the window. The rain has returned outside, chilly and slender. Like shadows practicing a play no one wanted to perform. Pedestrians moved beneath umbrellas. He got up and gave both men a nod. I'll return tomorrow. Then he turned and walked out of the cafe, sighing as the door closed behind him. For a Thursday, there was little activity at the police station on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. The sergeant behind the front desk nodded respectfully to Maigret without saying anything, while the typewriter in the corner hammered out a report with mechanical indifference. Maigret hung his hat on the hook in his office, removed his coat, and gazed at the framed map of Paris on the distant wall for a moment. He was unwilling to accept the case. He hadn't been given the task. However, something drew him in, and now he was entangled out of curiosity rather than obligation. The place had an unreal feel about it. Not yet, not foul play. However, there was a layer of deceit that was both essential and not malevolent. He wrote a brief note to the coroner's office, asking for the seamstress's body's preliminary results. He didn't think much would come of the report. There's no indication of violence. No blood, not a single bruise. If poison had been there, it would have been subtle. Either something she had taken herself or something that was gradually supplied. She hadn't appeared suicidal, though. She had appeared surprised. Stopped. By nightfall, Maigret was back on the Boulevard de la Chapelle. Mist formed at the borders of the street lamps, and the rain had decreased to a whisper. He observed the windows above, their light filtered by yellow curtains, from the other side of the cafe. Leaning against the chilly stone of the adjacent bakery, he lighted his pipe. It was now dark outside the seamstress's window on the third floor on the left. Hours before, the body had been removed, but her impression was still there. A woman whose hands were skilled. A calm life, but not a solitary one. That building had a tale, Maigret thought. However, it wouldn't come from hints or confessions. Slowly, like water rising through crevices, it would happen through side glances, half-spoken memories, and neighbors recalling too late what they ought to have said sooner. Tomorrow he would start with the neighbor who is deaf, Madame Charrière. Then, if there was one, the cafe owner's wife. Husbands did not see what wives did. And to locate Madame Poinceau, the baker, he would stroll the surrounding streets, such as Rue Ambroise Paré and Rue de Maubeuge, and maybe the Dancer, if fortune favored it. But he would watch tonight and hold on. A tram bell rang in the distance. Too loud for the hour. Someone laughed. A feline crept by the alley. A thin, pale person stepped behind the cafe's foggy glass, still looking at the stairs. The vendor of the fabric. He remained there. I'm still waiting on something that never came back. As was customary in the early spring, the following morning dawned late. Light arrived grudgingly, filtered through heavy clouds that felt like an agonizing weight pressing against the rooftops. Despite rising early, Maigret did not immediately head to the station. Rather, he sat at the kitchen table with an unopened slice of bread with quince jam next to him while he drank a bowl of dark coffee. The room was warm but silent, and Madame Maigret had already departed to pick up some lace that she was having repaired in the Rue Saint-Martin. The fragrant envelope he had brought with him was placed on the table without being opened. There was still a hint of that elusive scent on the paper. Floral, yes, but masked by habit or age. He pondered whether a woman had worn the fragrance personally or had just kept it close to her bed linens and allowed it to infiltrate the page without realizing it. He put on his overcoat, went outside around 9, and made his way to the Rue de Dunkerque. There was no rush, so he could have taken a car. But walking was how the city relinquished its little realities. He saw a guy carrying produce crates across damp cobblestones, a florist setting yellow tulips in buckets, and a line of youngsters waiting at the gates. Nobody appeared to be guilty. Nobody appeared to be innocent either. They just shifted. It was easy to locate the bakery. A tiny shop front with painted writing that read Boulangerie Poinceau was opposite, from a newsagent's booth halfway down the block. Like a promise, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted into the street. Inside, a heavy woman in her 50s put baguettes into a wire rack behind the glass counter, laden with pastries and loaves. When the last client, an elderly guy who was purchasing one brioche and moaning about the weather, had departed, Maigret went in and quietly removed his hat. Out of courtesy. "Madame Poinceau?" he inquired. Startled by his voice, she raised her head. "Yes, my name is Inspector Maigret. Could I talk to you for a minute?" Laurence Perrin is the woman in question. The name made a difference. It wasn't theatrical. Madame Poinceau didn't cry or drop a tray. However, her hands ceased to move. Her gaze shifted sideways. After giving a single nod, she emerged from behind the counter. Let's head to the rear. The bakery's back was tiled and compact, with a stack of crates on one wall and a folding table pressed against the other. She handed Maigret a chair after sighing and wiping her hands on her apron. "I assume you're referring about the girl who stitched my hem-stitching." "Yes." "Then she's dead?" Maigret didn't answer right away. He observed the woman's expression and the little pinching of her mouth, as though recalling a bitter taste she had not intended to taste. "Did she work for you?" "Every now and again, although she could fix an apron in half the time the others required. I don't go in for elaborate tailoring. Clean hands. And quiet. Never fussed. How recently have you seen her?" With her gaze fixed on the tiled floor, Madame Poinceau pondered for a while. "3rd week ago, 4 perhaps. I brought her a petticoat and 2 blouses. Things get in the way, but I believe I intended to return sooner." "Did she bring up any issues?" "She didn't say much about anything. The odd thing was that, even if you sat with her for 10 minutes, you would only hear a few words. Not timid, just reserved. She seemed to be carrying something heavy, but in secret." Maigret folded his hands across his knee and nodded. "Does she ever discuss her private life?" "No. She never even mentioned her origins. The provinces, I thought. That level of civility. Did she receive any calls on a regular basis? Men? Madame Poinsot hesitated once more, but not for long enough. She stated, "There was one." Once? I dropped off a package at her building and saw him emerge. Attractive kind, too cautiously shaved, walked as though he expected to be followed. Maigray's eyes squinted a little. Didn't you recognize him? No. However, he didn't look right. The kind of man who has a subtle scent of courtrooms and perfume. Courtrooms? She shrugged half-heartedly. Assume. However, I spent 20 years working across from a notary's office. You get the look. If you saw him again, would you recognize him? I believe so. Maigret put his hat under his arm and stood. I'm grateful. Another stuff. During your time with her, did she ever receive letters? Madame Poinsot furrowed her brow once, when a small child entered the bakery. He inquired about her residence. Claimed to have a message to convey. Third floor, left entrance, I informed him. It wasn't a post envelope, but I didn't see the letter, just a piece of folded paper. Maigret bowed his head in agreement. Madame, merci. After leaving the bakery, he went 2 streets before coming to a corner cafe. There he smoked quietly while getting his normal black coffee from the zinc counter. Now, he had only outlines. Not yet. No facts. Once visited by a man who didn't belong in her world, she was a quiet woman who was exact with her hands and unseen to most. A well-dressed man. A letter that was not mailed. Maigret returned to the boarding house before noon. The officers had now sealed the entrance to room 8 and secured it. However, Madame Charrière, the neighbor who was allegedly deaf, had a room across the small hallway. Mostly out of habit, he knocked softly at first, then louder. "Coming, coming," croaked a voice inside at last. The door opened an inch, revealing a very skinny woman with a face like a wrinkled bedsheet and sparse white hair knotted in loops. She blinked as she peered up at him through heavy glasses. "You are the police officer?" Maigret gave a small smile. "Indeed. Could I enter?" She shuffled back inside after waving a weak hand. The scent of mothballs and lavender oil filled the room. A little dog, blind in one eye, gazed at him from the bed, while a radio stood idly on a bookcase. Before he had even taken a seat, she remarked, "I didn't see much. However, did you hear something? Until I insert the ear trumpet, I don't hear anything." I didn't. He gave a nod. "Did she say anything to you? Perrin, mademoiselle?" "Occasionally. Typically only greetings. She occasionally placed packages outside my door. Repairing." I used the wall slot to pay her. "No grievances?" "Not from me. She was nice, but sad. Like someone waiting behind her eyes with awful news." After observing the dog for some time, Maigret got up. "I'm grateful, Madame Charrière." She glanced up at him once more. "Did she get hurt?" "We don't know yet." "This city wasn't meant for her," the elderly woman whispered. "Some individuals aren't." Once more, Maigret stood in the hallway and listened to the sounds of the home for a considerable amount of time. There was a rattle from a pipe. Footsteps rose from the street in the distance. There were currently no further answers in room 8, behind its sealed door. But someone else would say it. Eventually, they did it every time. The afternoon sky pressed the rooftops into silence as it hung low over Paris like a grey ceiling. Once again, Maigret stood across the street from the boarding house, hands in his coat pockets, cap low on his brow. 4 levels of weathered shutters and pale plaster smeared with years of soot and precipitation made up the unremarkable facade. It was the type of location that most people would walk by without noticing. Not Maigret's, though. He kept an eye on the door. Not because he was hoping for a big show. Truth didn't come that way. It arrived softly, awkwardly in timid tones, or on soft shoes. And Maigret had long known that when no one seemed to be looking, people let themselves be seen. The cafe below was almost deserted now, save for a few tables where residents sat bent over small cups of brandy and dominoes. Lemoyne, the proprietor, continued looking through the panes of the glass, as though he was trying to figure out if Maigret was just killing time or waiting for disaster. A tall, angular woman with a long black umbrella that tapped lightly on the sidewalk with each stride emerged at the end of the street at exactly 2:15. She stopped in front of the entrance of the boarding home, looked up at the windows, and checked the number. Then she came in. Maigret followed her up the steps and crossed the street without slowing down. The first landing, he caught her. She was examining the banister's flaking paint as if she wasn't sure if she should go on. "Are you trying to find someone?" Gently, he inquired. Startled, she turned. Her pale skin and well-defined eyebrows gave him the impression that she was older than he had assumed, possibly in her mid-50s. Her clothing wasn't loud, but it was expensive. A silk scarf, a black wool coat, and shoes that had not been worn much. "Yes," she replied. "My goal was to talk to Mademoiselle Perrin." Maigret took off his hat and held it in one hand. "Regretfully, she is no longer present." The woman tensed, but not startled. More like she was waiting for approval. "She's gone?" "Yes." He didn't say anything else. His face was probed by the woman's dry gray eyes. "I sensed something." "Why?" She paused, looking toward the third level, and then down the stairs as though the answer were still pending. "She didn't respond to my previous email. I assumed she might have gone." "You were familiar with her?" "Not very good, but long enough to understand that she didn't disregard others." "Will you accompany me to the cafe?" Maigret inquired. "Just a second." She glanced at him once more, assessing something. "Indeed. Okay." Silently, they went down together. Maigret returned to the cafe and sat down at a table toward the back, away from the front window. The woman sat with her back straight and her gloved hands folded precisely on the table after putting her umbrella neatly against the wall. Maigret motioned for 2 cups of coffee. He introduced himself as Inspector Maigret. "And you?" She paused just a moment. "Geneviève Delorme. And how do you relate to Mademoiselle Perrin?" A beat. Then, "Her employer was me, sort of." Maigret waited. She went on, "I manage a small theater company. It's more of a private salon than a true theater. For readings, performances, and recitations, we commission costumes. There's nothing shocking, I promise. Lawrence worked for us on occasion." "Changes and repairs?" "She was skilled with challenging textiles. How long had you known her, too?" 2 years? Maybe a bit longer. "She was introduced to me by a friend who employed her for glove stitching." "Did you frequently see her?" "Only when I brought something. She chose to remain at her apartment rather than come to us. I appreciated that." The coffees showed up. After thanking the waiter, Maigret slowly shook his. "Has she discussed her life with you at any point?" "She kept to herself, not antagonistic, but... Be careful, I always thought she had been harmed. One of those women who creates walls of calm rituals. You know, the kind." Maigret gave a nod. "Did she appear afraid lately?" Geneviève Delorme gave that some thought. "No. Maybe exhausted, distracted, not scared, though. You mentioned that she hadn't responded to your last message." "Yes. I had written to her to ask if she could change the velvet cape's hem. Usually at her request, I tucked the message in the frame of her door. I waited when she didn't respond. However, I made the decision to check in person today." Maigret pulled the envelope from underneath his coat. Gently, he set it on the table. "Is this yours?" Leaning forward, she lifted it in one gloved hand and flipped it over. "Yes," she replied. "My handwriting looks like that." Her speech was free of fear, just a hint of sadness. Maigret remarked, "She never opened it?" "I understand." He stopped, observing her intently. "Are you aware of a man that paid her a visit, nicely attired, mid-40s, perhaps, with a background in law?" Her gaze shifted to the sky. Not shocked, but cautious. "No. She never spoke of such a person. But you think there was a person?" Yes, I did have a suspicion. There were times. She had mascara under her eyes, as though she had been crying. The one time I brought a bodice to be fixed, I inquired as to her health. She claimed not to have slept. And you didn't say anything else? I'm not one to put pressure on others. Maigret put down his coffee cup after finishing it. He waited, allowing the quiet to grow. She finally leaned a little closer. She lowered her voice and replied, I might be mistaken. However, I always thought she was anticipating something. Or someone. After some time, you can tell. The manner in which doors are heard, their attire even when no one is around. Maigret gave a slow nod. She wasn't conceited. However, she was always ready. As though she expected someone to knock, even if they had never done so. They continued to sit for a moment. I'll come, she said. If you remember anything, he continued softly. Even something that didn't seem important at the time. Indeed. She got up, grabbed her umbrella, and left. For a long time, Maigret sat by himself at the table, observing the swirl of cream at the bottom of his cup. The mist was back outside, just enough rain to make the outlines of buildings and people hazy, and a picture had started to take shape in Maigret's thoughts. Not of a homicide, not quite yet, but of a life that is confined, veiled by anticipation, and maybe, just possibly, by disappointment. He believed that something had come too late, or not at all. When Maigret got back to the station shortly before sunset, the hallways were silent, as though the structure itself was getting ready for the nightly silence. The rain had started up again, but this time it was a gentle, lingering murmur on the windows, the kind that smelled of damp stone and city soot and soaked into coat collars. A typewriter yawned over a partially completed report as he moved through the main room and entered his office, shutting the door with the smallest click. He was met by the familiar smell of dust and pipe smoke. Without turning on the lamp, he took off his coat, threw it over the chair, and sat at his desk. He only listened for a few minutes, to the building's creak, to the wall clock's tick, to the silence that occasionally revealed more than any interview. The preliminary note from the coroner was sitting on the desk, folded in half. He pulled it open. Lawrence Perrin is the subject. About 32 years old, unknown heart failure was the cause of death. No indications of external trauma. Initial toxicology revealed no evidence of common toxins. Analysis is still awaited. Maigret reclined. He wasn't interested in the reason of death just yet. It was the lack of it. Not a single bruise, no violence, no typical poisons. Still, there was no indication that the woman had resisted or reached for assistance as she lay lifeless on her bed, with a needle laying on her top. Death was not what she had anticipated. The disturbing aspect was that, for a moment, the match's flame illuminated the dim walls as he lit his pipe. After a few seconds, he grabbed for the slim black address book they kept for small civil references, which included lists of known lodgers, building owners, landladies, and registered tenants. He turned to the Boulevard de la Chapelle boarding home entrance. Names were inscribed in pencil next to the room numbers in a thin column. Room 1, vacant. Room 2, Watchmaker Dufresne. Room 3, R. Benesh Pupil, mais. Charrière in room 4. Room 5 is unoccupied. Storage is in room 6. Room 7, F. Marshal, a business representative. Room 8, L. Perrin. Maigret slowly skimmed the page. Something was absent. He took out a manila envelope from his desk side drawer, which contained the witness statement of the fabric vendor who had discovered the body. Maigret read the line he had already highlighted again. Marshal and Frère, Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière is where I work. He hesitated. Room 7, F. Marshal. Marshal, the same one? He stepped to the outside room where a young clerk was organizing receipts, pipe clenched between his teeth. Gaston, he said, do a look-up for business registration on my behalf. Frère and Marshal, Poissonnière du Faubourg Rue. The boy gave a nod, before vanishing down the corridor. Maigret went back to his chair and puffed thoughtfully, his brows knitted with slight annoyance rather than bewilderment. He didn't think coincidences happened. He thought that individuals were hiding behind their names, their manners, and their documentation, and it did not set well with Laurence Perrin to have a Marchal in the same building. Gaston came back with a slip of paper 20 minutes later. Francois Marchal is the registered owner of Marchal & Frères. The company was founded in 1927 and covers textiles and the delivery of clothing items. Room 7 is the registered address, which corresponds to Maigret's personal apartment. He tapped the stem of his pipe against his desk. Marchal, Francois? The individual who had discovered the body was therefore not only a delivery lad, the owner was him. Nor had he stated so. The boarding house was darker than usual around 8 o'clock that night. The ground-floor cafe and Madame Charrier's window's dim yellow glow were the only sources of light. Maigret observed individuals passing with umbrellas, bowed against the wind, while she stood under the canopy of a shuttered newsstand. He waited. Marshall left at 5 minutes after 8 o'clock. Same slender frame. Same neatly brushed hair. With a canvas package beneath one arm, he looked both ways as though he wasn't sure of his own path. Maigret moved across to stop him. "Good evening, Mr. Marshall." The man's shoulders were splattered with rain as he blinked in surprise. "Oh, Inspector, are you heading somewhere?" "Just delivering some fabric," I said. "At this hour—" The man was hesitant. "I needed to complete a task. I need to clear my head." Maigret collapsed next to him. "We chatted just now. In the coffee shop. You claimed to have provided textiles." "Yes. However, you didn't mention that you shared a building." Marchal didn't answer right away. He opened his mouth a little, then shut it again. "I didn't think it was relevant," he finally stated. Maigret remained expressionless. "Nevertheless, room 7 is where you are listed, just next to hers." Marshall gave a slow nod. "I lease the space for the company. On occasion, when I work late, I sleep there." "And how frequently does that occur?" "Not too often, but frequently enough to pick up on her movements." "Or guests." Marshall looked over at him. He didn't look defensive. It appeared, if anything, resigned. "Inspector, do you believe I hurt her?" "I don't believe anything. I pose inquiries." After a lengthy silence, he remarked, "She never told me much." She worked in silence. We occasionally talked about thread, fabric, and vintage movies. Jean Gabin was someone she liked. Did you find her admirable?" Marchal averted his gaze. "I felt sorry for her." Maigret halted her stride. The pavement was slapping from the increased intensity of the rain. "Sorry?" She seemed like someone who had hoped for something and never succeeded. "Did you send her a letter?" "No." "Were you in love with her?" Marshall winced. "No. Not affection, not exactly." Maigret remained silent. Allow the quiet to be filled with air. If the man wants to fill it, let him. Finally, Marchal stated, "She once told me that she used to embroider veils for a shop on Rue du Caire. That the following day, a woman she had created a bridal veil for cancelled her wedding." "Why?" she asked. "No, the woman only gave the veil back." Marchal turned his gaze to the rain. Lawrence kept it too. Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Did she still own it?" "Yes, inside a box. I once saw it. It was her reminder, she said." "Of what?" "That some people have second thoughts." Maigret stood silently for a while. Then he gave a nod. "I'll be returning to talk to you once more." Marshall gave a nod before turning and moving into the fog, his shoes making a soft tapping sound as he did so. And Maigret realized that the veil was more than just fabric as she stood in the drab light of a street lamp. Grief was neatly packaged and held upon, for someone who long ago made a vow and never came back. That Saturday morning was wet with the kind of steady, persistent rain that seeps rather than soaks. Into collars, into shoes, into old people's bones, and into police officers' patience. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat behind his desk and gazed not at paperwork, but at the area outside the window, where the roofs across the Seine flickered in and out amid strands of fog. His sleep had been fine. He hardly ever did. Sleep, however, was never an escape for Maigret. It served as a bridge and a passageway to further inquiries. The same little folder, titled Paris, Laurence, Deceased, Preliminary File, was sitting on the blotter in front of him. A moniker. An address. Pending is included in brackets in a sentence concerning natural causes. She was surrounded by a small group of people who had barely known her. Still, she persisted. Her demeanor was not that of an incomplete individual, but rather that of a misunderstood one. He rose up after lightly tapping his pipe on the ashtray. A few seconds later, with the Seine rumbling just over the embankment, he was walking down the building's front stairs, with his hat pulled low, and his overcoat buttoned. He didn't summon a vehicle. That morning he liked the metro better. In motion, people were more revealing. At Gare du Nord, he came out and walked through the winding lanes that branched off from the main road like weary capillaries. Here, the cafes weren't that busy. They bided their time. Maigret did the same. In the usual silence, the boarding house loomed. Slowly, he went up the stairs and paused outside room 7. Marchot wasn't present. There were no noises coming from behind the locked door. He advanced to room 8. The keyhole remained undamaged, and the police seal was still in place. For a long minute, he stood with his hands in his pockets and inhaled the smell of old wallpaper and damp wood. After then, he turned around and softly knocked on Madame Charrier's door once more. This time, it took her longer to respond. She appeared slimmer than she had only a few days before. Despite not barking, the small dog on the bed lifted its head. "You again," she murmured, not in an unpleasant way, just a couple more inquiries. She opened the door for him. This time, he didn't sit. "Have you ever witnessed a man pay Mademoiselle Perron a visit in the evening? Nicely attired, assured, someone who was not a local resident?" She pondered. Finally, she said, "There was a man, tall, narrow face. Arrived after dark every time. He was silent. She would open the door for him, and it would softly close after him. How frequently? Possibly twice a month. Every Thursday." Maigret's eyebrow went up. "Certain of the day? I can recall, because I soak my feet on Thursdays. I keep the door open to let the steam from the hot water out. I would watch him rise. I once overheard them conversing. Not too loudly. However, there was a decision involved, or rather, about holding out for one. Did she mention him at any point?" "She never mentioned anything." Maigret gave a nod. After thanking her, he went back down to the café. The owner, Lemoine, looked up as Maigret walked in, unsurprised. "Coffee, please. And maybe you might respond to a question that has been on my mind." Lemoine cautiously poured the coffee. "Did any men pay Mademoiselle Perrin a visit?" The proprietor of the café scratched his head. "Not too often. However, absolutely. There were a couple of men I saw. The same one every time. A little older than her. Had on a dark overcoat, one of those velvet-trimmed coats. Appeared to be someone who was accustomed to being allowed entry." Maigret gave a nod. "Has he ever talked to you?" "Never. Didn't even look. Straight up and straight down. Always appeared to be preoccupied." "When was the last time you saw him?" Lemoine reclined and pondered. "It was just over a week ago." "Perhaps on Thursday?" "No, that was Thursday, really. Behind the bar. I had the TV on. There was a storm approaching. He got there right before the thunder began, so I recall. And he went away?" "Right away. No more than 10 minutes." "After his visits, did Laurence appear different?" "I'm not sure. She didn't stay. Like a shadow, it came and went." Maigret took a drink of his coffee. It was excellent, slightly burned, just the way he liked it. He remained silent for a while, gazing into the cup. Quietly then, "Have you seen him since?" "No." "Would you be able to identify him again?" Lamoigny was hesitant. "I believe so." Maigret gave a nod. He paid without counting the coins, finished his coffee, and walked out. He called Janvier back to the police and told him to start looking through civil court records and registration entries for anyone who fit the physical description and lived close to Gare du Nord, including judges, clerks, notaries, and junior lawyers. Not high-ranking officials, but the kind that got away with it. "Pay attention on Thursdays," Maigret advised. "Appearances in the afternoon or early evening. Any man having past ties to tailor shops in Montmartre or Rue du Caire." Janvier arched his eyebrow without posing a question. The assistant came back in the late afternoon with a slip of yellow paper with a name scrawled on it. Delcourt. Paul, notary, mid-40s, resides on Dunkirk Road. Known to get readings at a private salon. Married. After reading it again, Maigret reclined on his chair. He thought about the woman with the black umbrella. Geneviève Delorme. A personal salon. Outfits for reciting. Someone had left a note under Laurence Perrin's door. After tapping the paper with his thick finger, he went back downstairs. Paul Delcourt personally answered the door, a slender man, well-dressed, with eyes that gave nothing and graying temples. He had a polite but uninteresting expression, as if he had rehearsed being unimportant. Maigret offered his card and remarked, "Inspector Maigret, may I enter?" Delcourt pulled the door open. The unit was quiet and well-organized. By the door hung a woman's coat. A toddler learning scales could be heard playing piano in the background from another room. "Does this have to do with a client?" Delcourt inquired. "It concerns a female, Perrin, Lawrence." There was no abrupt response. However, something changed at the back of the eyes. Not remorse. Fatigue. "I understand. Could you tell me how you got to know her?" Delcourt poured a glass of water after approaching the sideboard. He didn't give Maigret one. "She was someone I knew back in the Rue de Caire. Lawrence worked in the back while my wife ordered gloves. Be quiet, girl. Gorgeous hands. You recently paid her a visit." "Yes. Why?" Delcourt was hesitant. "Because I was a coward once, and I was curious to see what was left." Maigret remained silent. 15 years ago I met her," Delcourt replied softly. "Prior to being married. She was softer and younger. Yes, I was. Not courageous. We went for walks in the evenings. I vanished. Did you see her once more? The previous year, by happenstance. Outside the post office, she stood, we talked. She didn't discuss the past. I still felt it, though. After that, I went to see her twice, Thursdays. I told my wife the truth. I just remained silent. Did she have higher expectations? The glass was drained. By Delcourt. He said, "She waited, but I just came to take a peek." "And when was that last?" Delcourt's gaze locked with Maigret's. "Don't come again unless you intend to stay," she said. Maigret gave a slow nod. "Did you?" "No." There was silence in the room. Maigret fiddled with his hat. "I'm grateful, monsieur. That's it. For the time being." Without saying another thing, he departed. The rain had ceased outside, but the city was still breathing its slow, silent evening breath, and the streets were still glistening. And a veil was folded in a box somewhere, in a sealed chamber above a silent cafe, waiting for someone who didn't intend to come back. A damp, lingering darkness that lasted from morning to evening without offering any promises was the kind of drab that arrived on Sunday and never fully transformed into light. Early in the morning, the streets were almost deserted, as if the city itself had decided to stay in bed and listen to the gentle trickle of water from trees and gutters. While passing him his evening glass of Armagnac, Maigret had spent the night at home, silently conversing with Madame Maigret, who had said little, but whose eyes had scanned his face for a longer period of time than normal. He was standing on the boarding-house stairs on Boulevard de la Chapelle again, He walked slowly and solely with contemplation rather than fatigue. As usual, the building was quiet, worn out, and had a little smell of old glue and boiled cabbage. In his pocket was the key to room 8. The previous evening, the police seal had been taken off. The room would be devoid of any dramatic elements. He wasn't searching for traces, fingerprints, or anything the media would bother to publish. He was searching for what individuals, not the law, had overlooked. There was a gentle click when the lock turned. The room was still the same inside. With the drapes drawn but not completely closed, the air felt a little stale, and the floor was covered in long gray shadows. He paused to stand in the middle, as if listening for something, and left the door open behind him. Thread spools were still gathering in a little container on the sewing table by the window. A pair of shears, their tips resting on the incomplete hem of the gray flannel dress she had been working on, glinted dimly in the dim light. There was still a needle stuck in the fold. He approached the closet and carefully opened it. Modest, well-maintained clothing. Nothing glitzy, just a coat or two. However, there was a cardboard box hidden behind a line of subdued colored dresses at the back. Gently, he took it off, placed it on the bed, and opened the cover. The veil was within. The kind of pale ivory that is no longer worn. The artistry was delicate, with threadwork resembling filigree that was whisper-thin and nearly vibrating in the light, even though the lace had yellowed slightly at the margins. A little satin purse and a bit of pale blue ribbon were delicately folded beneath it. Lifting the veil, Maigret held it up to the light. It was worn or ready to be put on. Then it was hidden, the way a memento of remembrance, not delight, is hidden. He put it back and stood looking at it for a while, just experiencing the silence that seemed to emanate from the box, rather than thinking. Then he looked at the little bedside table. The same tin powder, the dough-geared book. A comb, and a half-folded slip of paper at the back of the drawer, tucked behind an old postcard of the Parc Monceau. He pulled it open. The immaculate, overly controlled handwriting gave the impression that the writer was terrified of making a mistake. I will if I am able, but it doesn't wait long enough. If I can, I'll come, but don't have high expectations. He read the note once more while perched on the bed's edge. 3 days before her death. The date is approaching. Not mean. Not cozy. Only the sort of statement that conveys more information through omissions. After putting the paper back in the drawer, he sat for a while, smoking his pipe and listening to the room's voice. Not with facts, but with emotion. The way the flannel was illuminated. Her shoe's impression is still visible on the carpet next to the chair. The teacup on the table had been rinsed and put back without being used because of this. He recalled Paul Delcourt, his reserved demeanor, his melancholy little admission. Genevieve Delorme, who had shown up with an umbrella and a lack of surprise in her eyes, came to mind as well. Between those two names, something had occurred. A long time ago, something that had remained constant. In the interim, Lawrence Perrin had waited, unremembered and unforgotten. A woman in a small space, her veil folded, and her silent hope that love will return someday. Maigret got up and walked across to the sewing table again. Beneath a piece of muslin was a black notepad. Gently he opened it. It was a work ledger. Names, addresses, and repaired or stitched things are neatly recorded. Poinsat, 1 bodice, 2 hems. Cape repair in Delorme, 3 days. Madame Roche. Get your gloves on. However, there was a name. Between the lines, not in the column. Delcourt. No accusation. Once. Twice. Then nothing else. Once more. Poinsot was the last name written. As though Laurence had gone back to what was known in an attempt to subtly erase the previous one. He tucked the book into his coat after closing it. Maigret returned to the Quai d'Orfèvre about midday. The city was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp iron and the subtle oil of streetcars, but the rain had stopped. He discovered Janvier beside the window reading a newspaper. "Is Paris still where Delcourt is?" Janvier gave a nod. "This morning, in his office. Filed in court on a scheduled basis." All right, let him do his job. Maigret took the phone and walked into his office. "Get me Madame Delorme," he added after a pause. A short wait, then a clear but distant voice. "Inspector?" "Yes. I want you to see what I found." Quietness. At last, she responded, "I understand. Where?" As if she hadn't changed from the last time, she arrived within an hour wearing black once more. Though tranquil, her eyes were watchful. Without an invitation, she went into Maigret's office and sat down. Between them, he set the veil box on the table. Without touching it, she examined it. Then he opened it. Neither said anything for a while. "She created this," Maigret said. Madame Delorme replied, "I understand. Have you seen it before?" "She once revealed it to me, told me it wasn't for any one person. However, she kept it as if it were awaiting a name." Maigret grabbed the ledger and flipped to the page where the entries were labeled P. Delcourt. "Have you ever heard her mention his name?" "No," she replied. "However, I was aware. When a lady is waiting for someone who no longer knocks, other women can tell." Maigret gave her a look. "She was powerful," Madame Delorme added. "But not shield. She wished. And she used that hope to create something. That was her sole form of retaliation. Do you think he hurt her?" "No," she replied. "Or forward worse, she was let down by him." Maigret shut the container. He gave one nod. He remarked, "She passed away quietly. We might never be able to determine if it was the heart or something more profound." She remarked, "She died waiting." "No," said Maigret. "She passed away knowing he wouldn't show up." And there was complete silence in the office for a while. The Notre Dame bells outside started to chime the hour, steadily and slow, like a clock that never hurried. Maigret considered the veil and its weight once more, as he observed the woman in front of him. Gentle breeze carried the clouds eastward over Paris on a Monday morning, causing brief slivers of light to travel across rooftops before vanishing. The pavements, which were dotted with bicycle tracks and the footprints of early workers, sparkled with a kind of muted reflection, even if the city had shed its raincoat for the day. With the veil box gone, and the ledger in a drawer, Maigret sat in his office behind the same worn desk, freshly shaven, and already smoking his second pipe. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled halfway up his forearms, revealing his big wrists and a timepiece that hadn't kept accurate time in years. His jacket hung on the back of the chair. He was just waiting for a rhythm to develop, not for a response. He did it that way. If you watched long enough, a pattern would emerge. People believed that questioning led to answers. Maigret was wiser. They emerged from quiet. His thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Lapointe was young, still exhibiting the rigidity of a person who had not yet learned to put his hands down. He held out the paper and stated, "The coroner just sent the full toxicology." Maigret motioned him to set it down on the desk. He didn't open it right away. He gave Lapointe a look. "Have you encountered persons who pass away without experiencing any illness?" Lapointe blinked. "I don't think I understand." "Those who appear to be doing well? No adversaries, not a single bruise. No reason. However, they eventually stop moving. Like they'll just do it. Let's go." Lapointe adjusted his balance. "I've heard about these things. That's for doctors, isn't it? The body is seen by the doctors. However, we can see the surrounding lives, the factors that influence someone to continue or give up." After lightly tapping his pipe on the ashtray, Maigret eventually picked up the envelope. He cut it open. Subject, Lawrence Perrin, toxicology. No barbiturates, opiates, morphine, arsenic, or cyanide were found. Heart. Possible congenital abnormality. Little structural weakening observed. Not unusual in females with comparable ages and physiques. Conclusion. Heart failure continues to be the cause of death. No influence from pharmaceuticals. No evidence of external cause. The death most likely happened between 2 in the morning as well as 4 a.m. Maigret reclined, and there it was, maybe a weak heart, not enough, though, to foretell the end. Furthermore, there is no explanation for the specific calmness in her face or the orderliness of her preparations. Not a trace of dread, resignation only. He nodded to Lapointe and then grabbed the notebook once more, this time his own, not the coroner's, in which he jotted down notes that were never formally filed. He turned the pages and came upon the scribble, Marshall didn't bring up the ledger. Are you still waiting? And below, there's no denying Delcourt. No defense. No crime, though. No arrest. No fee. Still, Maigret felt uneasy. Not because he thought the facts would prove guilt. However, the facts never showed guilt. It persisted between them, in the silence, in the vacant seat at the table. Getting up, he put on his coat. It was time to talk to the physician on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. Behind a bakery that was always reeking of aniseed, Dr. Leon Jouvet operated a little surgery. Before the coroner arrived, the precinct had called him as the attending physician to inspect Laurence Perrin's body. With the careless kindness of a guy who'd already forgotten 3 patients since breakfast, he greeted Maigret. He pulled out a chair for the inspector and responded, "Ah, yes, the young lady. Wasn't she a seamstress? A case of sadness. You didn't see any injuries? Not at all. Not even the typical symptoms of malnourishment or persistent weariness. For someone in her situation, her health was respectable. Nevertheless, her heart failed." The physician sighed. "Inspector, the human heart is a mystery. It's not just chambers and valves, it can carry more than just blood at times." Maigret silently observed him. He remarked, "There was a look on her face. A sort of silence." The physician gave a nod. "It's common for folks to pass away alone. She didn't appear scared, though. I'll say that. She appeared, ... ready, as if she had answered the door after a gentle knock from death." "Do you think she anticipated it?" "I think she had given up resisting." Maigret stood up and extended his hand. "I'm grateful." The doctor scowled as he accepted it. "Was there a suspicion of foul play, Inspector?" "No," Maigret replied. "Just out of sadness." He made one final visit to the structure on Boulevard de la Chapelle that afternoon. He did not ascend the steps. Instead, he took his normal seat in the café and ordered a glass of beer, which he did not touch. The proprietor of the café came over and washed the table needlessly. "Are you still considering her?" Maigret gave a nod. The man remarked, "I can't help it either. It's strange. When someone passes away in that manner, silently, the house seems to have lost a room." Maigret took a quick look at the stairs. "Did you ever catch her giggling?" The proprietor pondered. "No. Yes, I'm grinning when someone thanks you for holding the door. You smile like that. But giggling? No," Maigret said, swallowing the last of the beer and getting up. He claimed that she sewed clothes for people who never looked her in the eye. She fixed items that no one was willing to replace. She also started to wait somewhere along the line for something or someone that kept her in a state of suspension. With the door jingling softly behind him, he exited the café and entered the late afternoon light, which had somehow become softer and warmer. He thought about the folded veil in the box, the unposted letter, and the blank space in the ledger where someone's name had stopped showing up instead of justice or evidence, as he walked slowly back toward the Seine. There had been no murder of Laurence Perrin. They had forgotten her. More than any judge or coroner could explain, Maigret was aware that occasionally that was sufficient to cause death. The bells of Sacré-Cœur tolled somewhere above the rooftops, faint but constant, and he continued walking, his profile disappearing among the sluggish crowds. On paper, the lawsuit would stay open. However, Maigret believed that the door had shut. Under a pale sky, the Seine flowed quietly, its surface only sometimes disturbed by a passing barge or the long reflected ripple of a breeze that was too weak to be noticed on land. Standing at the Pont Saint-Michel, Maigret observed the river below him with the composure of someone who had run out of things to pursue. In his hand, his pipe was unlit. It wasn't necessary for him yet. Some mornings were designed for listening, not for steam or smoke. He could hear the city ticking away behind him, women coming out of boulangeries with baskets of fresh bread tucked under their coats, delivery guys yelling to one another across small streets, and trams moaning down their rails. Paris was changing. It did every time. For Maigret, however, the beat of the case was still not in sync with the beat of the city, not because it was still unsolved, it was, in a sense, solved, but rather because something persisted, a slight echo that continued to vibrate. The file was supposed to be turned in that morning. Shelve it, stamp it, and let the bureaucracy take over. As though the current might wash away the traces of Lawrence Perrin's tragedy, he had instead taken a different route, his feet taking him past the prefecture and down to the water. Eventually he made his way to the workplace on foot. The aromas of wet clothing, poor coffee, and typewriter ink were already permeating the passageways. As he walked in, Janvier looked up, but Maigret raised a hand without asking. Not quite yet. He entered his office, shut the door, and sighed as he settled into the hefty chair that moaned in its usual manner. He had left the case folder there, waiting. He opened it again, but for a different reason than necessity. It was something like respect. Perrin, Lawrence is her name at the top. She is 32 years old. Status no longer alive. Heart failure is the cause. Manner, normal, perhaps brought on by stress. Notes. No offenses were committed. There was no complaint made. No one is accused. He flipped the page. Remarks from Madame Charrier, Madame Delormeau, and Madame Poinceau. Testimonies veiled in ambiguous memories and half-phrases. Faces flashing with pity, perplexity, and shame that wasn't theirs, yet nevertheless touched them. Then came Paul Delcourt's name. That one attracted attention because of what it omitted, rather than because of any scandal. While someone else's life had stalled and wilted in a boarding house room filled with thread and waiting, this man's life had gone on, cleanly and publicly. There was a knock. He took a while to respond. Madame Maigret entered as the door slowly opened. She said, "I brought you something." She held a package, the type used by grocers, wrapped in brown paper and string. He blinked. "You didn't mention your arrival." "I didn't intend to, however. The weather seemed to be sitting on your shoulders." She took off her gloves and set the package on the desk. She didn't ask any questions or look at the paperwork. By this point, she was aware that not everything was appropriate to express verbally. After some time, Maigret stated, "She was the one who sewed." "Indeed. I recall what you said. A veil was stored in a box by her. Not worn, just... awaiting." Opposite him, Madame Maigret took a calm seat. "And now she is no longer there. Not that anyone wanted her gone, though, since nobody recalled to stay." His wife didn't respond right away. She glanced down at her hands, which were lovingly folded in her lap. After a while, she said, "People like that fade more than they die." Maigret gave a slow nod. She'd been fading for a while. Madame Maigret got up and put her hand over the top of his. "Well, at least someone saw it," she remarked. "Before it disappeared entirely, someone noticed." He smiled, but it was a small one, barely raising the corners of his mouth. He opened the package after she had gone. A sandwich. Hard cheese. A foil-wrapped, dark chocolate square. He opened the cheese first, chewed into it, and then looked at the folder once again. "I'm just holding space right now, not reading." He gave Madame Delorme back the veil box that afternoon. She greeted him in her salon, where the smell of old velvet lingered like a memory, and chairs were already heaped for cleaning. She didn't inquire as to why he brought it. Holding the weightless package in both hands, he gave it across. She would have preferred to be with an understanding person. Madame Delorme remained silent. She just set the box on a side table and put her hand on the top of the lid. "I think sometimes that people like Laurence are only given to us so briefly," she remarked softly. "They show up, fix what's wrong, and then disappear once more without ever requesting to stay," she inquired, Maigret remarked. Madame Delorme raised her head. "Once?" she inquired, to an individual who did not respond. "Ah," she replied. "Indeed." He didn't remain for long. Maigret returned to his office and sealed the report inside its envelope, writing a brief line at the bottom. "Nothing further needs to be done. Conditions that are compatible with solitary dying. Between a gas leak and a drowning, it would go via hands that signed and stamped, get filed among the city's silent tragedies. Not a scandal. No article. No trial." Maigret, however, was aware of what had occurred. Slow subtraction was the cause of her death. One day at a time. A heart that is quietly weary, but not flawed. "I'm sick of waiting." And he believed he owed her more than a closed file, even if the law had nothing else to do. He therefore made one final trip to the Rue de Faubourg-Poissonnière that evening, as the lights started to fade from the streets and the cafes turned on their lamps. Maigret remained for a full minute outside the building where Paul Delcourt maintained his notary office. He didn't enter. All he did was look. Not with charges, not with pardon, just a human, gentle glance. He turned and left after that, because distance helps us understand some things better. Additionally, some stories are intended to preserve not just their shape, but also their melancholy, much like the meticulously sewed seams of a clothing. On Wednesday, the rain came back, not hard, but with that gradual, recognizable drop that restored the texture of the city. Rooftops became slippery, the windows became blurry. Puddles were like ancient regrets on cobblestones. Maigret observed the drops fall down the glass and vanish at the edge of the frame from his window in the Quai des Orfèvres. They were not counted by him. He didn't give it much thought. All he did was observe. It was silent behind him, with the typical mess of piled folders, a battered overcoat on the rack, and a pipe in an ashtray that had long since lost its fresh tobacco scent. Neither calls nor guests were present. The only sounds coming from the passage outside are the reverberation of rubber soles in the hallway. Maigret believed that Paris had created the ideal day for introspection. The closing summary for the Perrine case was previously drafted by him. They had sent the file upstairs. The department came to the conclusion that there was no proof of purpose, no indication of criminal involvement, and the death was natural. Maigret had never met the cousin from the provinces who had claimed the body. He had come in a grey wool coat, signed the paperwork with a shaking hand, and gone without a word. 2 days had passed since then. Maigret hadn't done much on the case since. But it was still with him, in the way that quiet cases haunt. When the calm they leave behind feels louder than the life they carried, rather than the way that contentious situations remain, wailing for justice. Finally, he lighted his pipe for company rather than necessity. The slight aroma of dusting powder, the quiet sewing machine in the corner, and the lace veil folded like a secret never revealed brought back memories of Lawrence Perrin's room. A knock on the door was heard. The door opened despite his silence. "Janvier was the one," he said. "Someone here to see you, Chief. I won't say much. It's about the Perrin woman, though." Maigret's eyebrow went up. "Name." "Didn't provide one." "It's not the cousin, though. Someone else is doing it." Maigret gestured for Janvier to send them in after nodding and placing the pipe on its tray. The door opened once more a moment later. A young woman, no more than 25, wore a borrowed navy coat and had dark, attentive eyes. She was uncertain about her welcome as she stood just inside the doorway. "Enter," Maigret whispered softly. "Did you wish to discuss Laurence Perrin?" She nodded and moved forward with a tentative yet arrogant stance. "I apologize for coming in this manner," she said, I had no idea who else I should ask. Maigret pointed to the chair on the other side of his desk. She smoothed her clothes and sat down. She identified herself as Claire Dallet. I was one of her students once. I learned to sew from her. Only in the evenings, when she had time, and not formally. I reside on Rue Ambroise Paré, 2 streets away. According to a person my mother knew who had a coat repaired by her, Lawrence was quiet, kind, and really talented. Maigret paid attention. I met her when I was 16 years old. At that time, she must have been just under 30. She didn't discuss herself much. She was patient, though. Sewing is about pattern and patience, she remarked, not speed. That silence was necessary for everything worth creating. Maigret leaned a little forward. You saw her a lot, or roughly a year. Then I halted, landed a job at a bakery. However, I occasionally saw her at the market. We would give a nod, say hello, perhaps. She was, however, clearly changing. I considered going to see her, but I didn't want to bother her. Maigret waited. Claire Dallet took a small, folded piece of cloth out of her pocket, a handkerchief that was neatly hemmed with tiny stitches. This is what she handed me. The final night I spent with her. Claimed that it was a drill for invisible threads. It was never used by me. However, I kept it. It was placed on Maigret's desk by her. He left it, untouchable. All he did was look. Claire added, her voice lower now. She used to say that some people wait their entire lives to be chosen, that they never ask for. All they want is for someone to notice them and say, You! You are my choice. Maigret gave a slight nod. The girl claimed, She told me that it was a dangerous way to live. After giving her a lengthy look, Maigret delved inside his drawer and took out the file. His note was written on the last page, which he opened. After giving it a single tap, he shut the folder once more. She didn't leave any letters, no guidelines, nothing but a veiled box. Claire blinked gradually. Did she still own it? Yes. I assumed she had forgotten it. He? Have you seen it before? She demonstrated it to me. Once. Stated that it was for the day she ceased to wait. Maigret reclined in his seat. He gave the remarks time to sink in. Was she dissatisfied? Claire paused. Not precisely, just, Quiet with a sense that went beyond quiet. It seemed as though she was constantly talking to an absent person. Maigret got up, moved over to the window, and opened it just a crack. Like lace, the rain had subsided into a gentle mist that brushed the rooftops. The air had a subtle scent of early blooms and moist stone. He pivoted. I assume she gave you good instruction. Claire's first smile appeared. She did. Are you still sewing? Not in a professional capacity. However, I make things right for the neighbors, for Mom. Maigret gave a nod. He said, Keep the handkerchief. It's a component of her. Claire folded it back into her coat after taking it gently. She got up to go, but she paused at the door. She didn't bid anyone farewell, did she? No, Maigret muttered, just to herself. After giving a single nod, Claire quietly slipped out onto the floor. Maigret walked home by herself that night. The apartment reverberated without Madame Maigret, who had gone to see her sister at Montparnasse. He sat by the kitchen window, watching the city breathe under the drizzle, after preparing a basic dinner consisting of potatoes, ham, and a glass of red wine. That evening, he didn't open any more cases. He didn't read. He just sat, listening to the sound of rain softly caressing the rooftops above and remembering a girl in a room in a boarding house. This narrative has no antagonists, not a single arrest. Only a life that had silently folded away, and a woman who had once aspired to be chosen. As in a coat pocket with a handkerchief, carefully stitched, awaiting discovery. Maigret rarely trusted the gentleness that Thursday morning brought to the city. The week's rain had cleaned the streets, and the sun peeked through in timid slivers, glinting against the spotless cafe chairs and the bicycles parked along the curbs like punctuation. The kind of morning that claimed to be hopeful was suggestive rather than boisterous. a subdued appeal to think that nothing terrible had ever occurred here. Earlier than usual, Maigret departed the apartment. Due to a delayed baptism and an issue concerning a friend's niece, Madame Maigret had left for the day. He fastened his scarf, gave her a cheek kiss, and moved to the beat of the city. He didn't bring a vehicle. In fair weather, he seldom ever did. Almost without conscious thought, his sneakers found their path. He was not yet aiming for the Quai des Orfèvres. The Rue de Dunkerque was the location. Even when no one discusses it, there was a certain quiet in the neighborhood the morning following a burial. The bread and the bakery next door appeared to be unopened, and half of the tables at the cafe on the corner were empty. Life was back on the road. However, it had done it a bit more carefully, as though it respected some nameless entity. For a while, he stood on the sidewalk across from the boarding home, staring at the third-floor windows that were closed. Then he went over and went in. There was nobody in the stairwell. There was no lock or police tape on the entrance of room 8. All that was gone was the dim outline of something. All of her belongings had been seized by the provincial relative. Maigret, however, was aware that something was always left behind. Always. He took a step he had never done before and climbed to the 4th story. Actually, there was no cause, just interest. The only feeling was that there was still something in the house that it hadn't released. He discovered the attic door open upstairs, only a little. The scent of dust, ancient wood, and time filled the air as a draft ruffled it. He went in. A few crates, an iron bed frame, and a broken chair made up the unimportant space. A sewing dummy, however, was hardly noticeable in the corner. Without a head, one arm is absent. Like afterthoughts, a few pins are still stuck in its side. Additionally, a muslin apron that was frayed at the hem and discolored and faded was hanging from the back of the door, either forgotten or not. He took a step toward her. L was the initials, which were lightly embroidered in the upper right corner. P. In terms of evidence, it was meaningless, but it was everything in terms of presence. It had been Lawrence Perrin. Here, something had been repaired, had labored, while the city whispered below, maybe late into the night. The springs moaned under his weight as he sat for a while on the edge of the bed frame. Flickers of azure sky appeared through the slats of the roof above. In the attic, there was no revelation, just recollection. Just the specter of someone who had made a concerted effort to be spaceless. Later, he ended up downstairs in the cafe. The owner, Lemoine, was sweeping, occasionally stopping to gaze out at the street. Maigret hesitated while placing her coffee order. The man from the cafe finally remarked, "You have been quiet lately." "It comes with growing older." "You haven't inquired about the relics." "I didn't have to." As one might anticipate, she was dignified, sorrowful, and more focused on the paperwork than the person. "She mentioned something," Lemoine continued, "as she walked away." "What was that?" "I didn't know she was loved by so many," she remarked. In actuality, though, she was the only person present, not a single blossom, nothing to say. Maigret slowly stirred his coffee. He remarked, "Love doesn't always leave evidence." Lemoine rested her head on the countertop. "You think so? I think she was in love. Additionally, that is a form of proof." Silence returned to the cafe, just the sound of a spoon tapping on ceramic. A wind twisted through the ajar door. "Did she ever ask for assistance?" Lemoine inquired, becoming more subdued. "No," Maigret replied, "and it gets worse because of that." Maigret went back to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres in the early afternoon. The station was once again bustling, with suspects moving between interviews, the sound of police boots, and the smell of old coffee. Interest in a recent robbery case had already started to grow, and the inspectors were already leaning toward notions like dancers getting ready for a show. He went through them without saying anything. He opened the bottom drawer in his office and removed a brown envelope. The little sewing ledger Lawrence had preserved was within. Measurements, names, and marginal remarks. The last time, he had left one sheet folded. He opened it now. A name that he had never seen before stood by itself, no address, no specifics, the name alone. Eloise. Written in a pen that was finer than the others. A female's name. Not on the list of clients, not to the beat of the ledger. Like a whisper right there. Maigret gazed at the object. He was not going to pursue it. Officially, no, that was no longer the focus. He was still curious, though. A companion? A sister? A daughter? A recollection? In years of discussion, some people leave more in a single name than others. He put the ledger back in the envelope, folded the page back, and sealed it again. He paused for a long moment before writing a note. Seamstress on the top floor, case file No. 43B/1953 has been archived. No legal action. No criminal charges were made. Emotional distress combined with a death that is congruent with personal history. The file has been closed. Human circumstances. He put his signature on it. Put the pen down and reclined in his seat. The sky outside darkened again, and the clouds gathered over the Boulevard de la Chapelle rooftop, over the stairwells and the peaceful cafes. It would rain once again. It did, every time. Additionally, it's possible that someone else in the city would discover Lawrence Perrin's work by opening a box, drawer, or folded fabric. A seam was repaired, reinforced hem. In the corner is a stitched name. Gentle, invisible, but intact.